Hey, good morning, everyone. All right, we're gonna get started here. All right, this panel here will discuss NextEra Energy's innovative methods and tools to validate completed compliance-related tasks while simultaneously identifying potential non-compliance precursors to initiate preventive action. NextEra's system provides real-time situational awareness and automated audit support, significantly reducing manual efforts and improving the accuracy and efficiency of NERC, CIP, and O&P compliance. So our presenters are Carlos Morales and Robert Wargo from NextEra, and Bill Fletcher will be called up at some point as well.
All right. Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? Everybody have a good night last night? Wonderful venue. I want to start off, first of all, thanking WECC for this invitation to talk to you guys today. We're really honored to be here. We're really proud and excited about sharing our journey over the last 5 years. I think the invitation to speak to you today really arose from a very unique meeting we had end of last year in December in the NICC, the NERC Information Command Center in our Jupiter office. We had all 6 regions spend a day with us. We had thought leaders from every region, including Bill Fletcher from WECC, Lou Folkert from RF, and others, spend a whole day in our NICC, the NERC Information Command Center. And we were proud to show what we had. We thought it was groundbreaking, and we wanted their view in terms of what we have, how we use it, what the future might look like, and what the future of really NERC compliance might look like via the implementation of a system like this. I think I know many of you. It was good to catch up with old friends. Like Curtis. I don't have an older friend than Curtis, but Stephen and Bill and Jimmy. It was great seeing everybody. I've been associated with NERC compliance for close to 20 years now. Spent more than 10 years at Reliability First, and I've been at NextEra for 5 years. I joined NextEra 5 years ago, and they hired me to oversee their CIP program across all NextEra companies. And when I joined them, the CEO, the CIO said, take the first year, assess our program, come back with your recommendations. So I was there for about a year. They called me back. I met with all the CEOs of all the business units, the general counsel, the CRO, the CIO. If they had a C and O in their title, I met with them. And they said, Bob, what did you find? I said, well, NextEra has a brute force compliance program for CIP. And they looked at me, what do you mean by brute force? And I said, well, we rely on SMEs doing heroic work day after day to keep us on the right side of compliance. And, we've pretty much maxed out our performance capability using the present system. And they said, and they were kind of taken aback by that. And they said, well, what can we expect in terms of performance? And I said, well, if you count up all the compliance tasks we do in 1 year, it equals to 1.5 million. We have 1.5 million separate compliance tasks we have to perform perfectly to be fully compliant. Now, are there any Six Sigma belt holders in the room? So let's see. Six Sigma is pretty good performance, right? But if you do Six Sigma against 1.5 million, you know what happens? You get five non-compliances per year. And when I explained it that way, the CEO said, but Bob, you realize that our plan is to triple the size of our business in 10 years. Because we had tripled from 2010 to 2020, and we're on the path to triple from 2020 to 2030. And they asked me, well, what is our program going to deliver if we're triple the size? And I said, well, our program isn't scalable. If you have 3 times the amount of work, you're going to have to hire 3 times the compliance staff to do that work. And instead of 5 non-compliances a year, you're looking at between 10 and 15 non-compliances a year. Now, that's not acceptable. I think the regulators will not accept that, but that's simple math. And that's simple math based on human tasks, human processes, and very little automation. Then they asked me, well, Bob, we've spent close to $100 million on these fancy tools like ChangeGear and Tripwire and QRadar and Splunk, and I could list another 20 of them. And they said, don't those help? And I said, well, that makes us data rich, but visibility poor. We have a lot of data, but it's embedded in tools and systems and lack context and lack oversight and lack, packaging into audible evidence. Not only that, but we use over 10,000 spreadsheets in our compliance program, 10,000 spreadsheets. And those spreadsheets might have been in SharePoint, document them, or sitting on somebody's laptop. And then they asked me, well, how do you know you're compliant? Are we compliant today? And I told them, well, hold that thought. I'll get back to you in 6 weeks after I put all the evidence together and come back and tell you whether we're fully compliant or not. And they said, that's not acceptable, and they said, well, do you have a plan? And I said, yes, Carlos and I have a plan. We have a concept, we have an idea, and we want to go forward with it. And the senior leadership said, Bob, hire the people that you need, spend the capital dollars that you need to spend. We can't live with 10 to 15 non-compliances per year. You're going to hear that journey. The last 5 years, that's the journey we've been on. A little bit about who NextEra is. We're a huge company. We're made up of several companies, NextEra Energy Resources, that's on the left there. They're in 49 states. They're not in Utah. I have no idea what we have against Utah. Utah is a fine state. I have some nice friends in Utah. And I keep telling them, get something in Utah so we could just say we're in all 50 states. I don't have to explain it. In the middle is FPL, and FPL is the largest electric utility company in Florida. We're vertically integrated, so that means we have our own generation, transmission, distribution. And then we have NextEra Energy Transmission. We're building transmission all over the country. I think if you look at who we are, we have just about every type of generation. We have every type of distribution, transmission. I just found out last week we have an oil peaker unit up in Maine and a black start unit oil up in Maine. I didn't know that. It only runs like 20 hours a year. But we have every generation type, nuclear, wind, solar. We're actually experimenting with hydrogen, using hydrogen in our natural gas plants. So that'll be an interesting journey. But I think what that tells you is that we're exposed to every situation. We're geographically dispersed, and you can see the kind of challenges that presents in terms of a compliance program. The other complexity is we're in all 6 regions. We get audited by every region. And since we only have one SIP program across all the enterprise, that SIP program gets tested on an annual basis. We finished up the WECC audit at TBC right before Thanksgiving, and that flowed right into the CERC audit of FPL right before Christmas. We got a nice Christmas gift from CERC. It was the A&L a week before Christmas. And, we're just in the middle of the CERC audit. Last week was the site visits. Next week will be the on-site interviews. We would not be able to perform well on all those audits without the NICC, without the NERC Information Command Center. And Carlos is going to tell you about that in a second. The last slide I have is something that looks very familiar to you. These are the most violated standards in 2023. Those of you that were around in 2007, 2008, and 2009, what was the most violated standard, O&P standard in that time frame? BRC 5 and FAC 9, which is now folded into FAC 8. Fast forward, 18 years, it's the same standards. Likewise, on the SIP side, what are the most violated standards back in 2010? SIP 7, SIP 10, SIP 4. And we as an industry are still there, right? Most violated standards. We're going to tell you how to beat them. That's what you hear about today. And we're fully confident that we've beaten them. And Carlos is going to tell you how we did it.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it. All right. So first and foremost, before I get into the content, what I would say is a couple things. As we go through the content, we'll have an opportunity at the end to ask questions. Drop down any slide numbers or specific questions that you have for slide numbers, because as we go through those questions, if we want to refer back to a slide, we can do that. Definitely write down any questions that you may have. Any questions that we are able to answer, we will answer here. And if not, we can always connect and we can get you an answer via email. We'll connect that way. I'm going to start off by taking you guys just through the journey that Bob alluded to. Okay, so if we go back to 2020, 2019, 2020, to Bob's point, we were approaching our SIP compliance obligations with a brute force method, where we would gather upwards of 100 SMEs easily when it would come time for an audit, and we would gather a lot of manual evidence. So you spin up the audit machine essentially and go attack any DRs that we would receive. It was a very reactive approach, and it required a lot of human time, a lot of human validation, really with zero net result in terms of meeting the purpose of each one of the SIP standards. It was really a response to an audit. Fast forward, we have a different approach that I'll take you through in terms of what we're doing different and how we view our compliance obligations from a SIP perspective. So a little bit about what we were doing before, just a little bit more of a deep dive. This was our typical approach. We would receive an audit notification letter and we would start preparing for that audit, perhaps maybe a couple months in advance prior to getting that A&L, through mock audits and bringing third-party vendors in and really pressure testing our capability to respond to the audit. Again, the focus there was responding to an audit whenever we knew it was coming. In doing so, we would find a lot of things that we either needed to tidy up and clarify, whether it be in our RSAWs or in our procedures, or maybe we even saw gaps potentially that we needed to make sure that we were able to explain to the audit team when they arrived. So a lot of that pre-work that we would do was individuals within individual business units sprinkled throughout the registered entity. They would go back, gather all their evidence, and we really didn't have a centralized team that could bring everybody together and help tell this unified story by that registered entity. It was very business unit siloed. So your IT department would go off and get their stuff, your power delivery, your power generation teams, they would go off and get their stuff. They would bring them all back to the mix. It was very fragmented in the sense of being able to tell the story by that registered entity. We then start to generate evidence once we got the A&L and we get that first volley of information. And we talk about the ERT workbook as that first MVP, if you will, or that first piece of information that's part of every audit package when we get audited by SIP. And same thing there. We would end up having all the business units individually go gather their information for the ERT workbook, and we'd end up with 4 ERT workbooks. And obviously, we can't give 4 ERT workbooks to the auditors, so we'd have to aggregate that. And in that process, we'd often fat finger things, copy paste errors. And I can't tell you how many times we would go and give an ERT workbook that there were just errors in between the tabs. So we're already starting off the audit not in a great way in terms of the confidence level from the audit team. But that was really our cycle of execution. Again, upwards of 100 SMEs, thousands of hours in terms of preparing for the audits. And to Bob's point, because we're audited so frequently, we would have to spin up this audit machine very often throughout the year. So you could have easily 3 audits in a year, depending on the registered entities that are being viewed or what region is coming in to audit us. Each one of those audits could easily reach up to $1 million in terms of O&M cost just to support that audit, just by spinning up this audit machine. Fast forward to today, we wanted to reimagine not only how we complied, but then also our organization and what it was missing to make sure that we could realize the vision that Bob talked about to our senior leadership. And that started with looking at how we complied differently. So this was not a story that we were telling the regulators by business unit, because the regulators were not auditing an individual business unit. This started by establishing a story for that registered entity. And so you see the 8 on top there that we have responsibilities for across all of NextEra. So these are our subsidiaries. These are the 8 that are within the purview of our program. We said, all right, we're going to put the focus where it should be, which is on those registered entities. But we need an organization that can serve as that glue, that can serve as that aggregator that common denominator across the companies. So that way, when the business units came up with their evidence, that we could help refine what they gave to us or bring clarity as it ties back to the registered entity, and also establish enterprise processes and standard evidence outputs. So that way they understood that if they were going to give us data, it had to be in a certain format so we can tell a unified story by registered entity. This required establishing a CIP Center of Excellence. So you can see that in the middle there. Today, our organization reports, while it reports under the Power Delivery Organization, our CIP Senior Manager is the Vice President of Power Delivery. We have purview over all of these registered entities and for all of these business units as it relates to our CIP compliance obligations. So everything starts with us in terms of process, tools, and people. So each individual business unit has their compliance teams or maybe compliance staff. So they might double dip in terms of being a system administrator and having CIP compliance execution responsibilities. And they all essentially roll up to us in a dotted line method where we can help them make sure that they ensure compliance, okay? That Center of Excellence team today is comprised of 3 pillars. We said we wanted to organize our work different than we did in the past. We were very CIP standard or CIP domain specific. We said we wanted to organize our work differently and reimagine how we did our work. So we have these 3 pillars: information management, program management, and risk management. I'm going to start off with program. So with program, the focus there was to say, where are we more common than we are different across the entity? And how can we establish enterprise process so that way, regardless of what entity was being audited, what region was coming in to audit us, we were telling the same story. So simplify our story in terms of process. Next would be, what does our execution evidence look like? How can we standardize that execution evidence? What common metadata associated with that evidence was needed in order to substantiate compliance and tell a unified story? So standardizing our evidence output, things of that nature. That team also supports any and all audits. So if we are audited, they're our first line of defense in terms of organizing the groups and gathering evidence for those audits. Next is information management. That team is responsible for, since we are a very data-rich environment, it's gathering in all of the information that we have in our organization and turning it into something that we can action upon, whether that be internal controls adoption and implementation, whether that be monitoring the execution of our work. That information management pillar is all things data, all things information. When it comes to risk management, it was really looking at our compliance obligations, less about checking the box, but really thinking about the purpose of each one of those standards and determining how can we mitigate risk? How can we truly achieve the purpose of that standard? So that risk management pillar is all about determining what risk is still residual even after we implement internal controls, and also identifying areas where we have no control, and then working back in unison with the other pillars to kind of level up a particular area or process domain. So now this is our world today. Our program approach has shifted. We've reimagined our work in the terms of how we're going to organize what we're going to do and how we're going to tell our story for each one of these registered entities. It starts with those registered entities. The business units are then next line in our defense in terms of being able to execute and produce evidence. And then we wrap that all with standard enterprise processes, standard common tool sets where we can apply them and have flexibility in terms of what's in that toolbox. And what that has given us the ability to do is realize 2 things: the ability to continuously monitor our program real time, and also drive our audit costs down and centrally support all of these registered entities from an audit support perspective. So you can essentially keep the SMEs that are running the grid, the system administrators, the DBAs, the firewall and network engineers, attached to their actual day jobs versus supporting audits. And we could actually take on a lot of that burden for them. So again, reducing that O&M component to audits, streamlining it, and bringing efficiencies to responding to audits while mitigating risk because we're implementing continuous monitoring. So let's talk about continuous monitoring. So before we could, it's very easy to say, let's go ahead and implement continuous monitoring. And if we probably polled the room right now, we'd probably get several definitions of what is included in continuous monitoring, because it's not necessarily defined for us. So we said, we're going to define it for ourselves, for our program. Before we go on this journey, let's talk about what is continuous monitoring. So our first item there is extremely important given the fact that we are a data-rich environment. Automated and verified systems. What does that mean? Well, you have systems like a Tripwire, a QRadar, a Splunk, a Trend Micro, tools that we use in order to not only execute on our compliance obligations, but to run the grid and to also afford the protections of these really important systems. Well, to have continuous monitoring, you need a way to automate bringing in that data and also validating that data to make sure that it's complete and accurate. This is just getting to first base, if you will, but minimum viable product in terms of an attributed piece of continuous monitoring. Second one there is timeliness, awareness, and real-time information validation. So it's no good if I have continuous monitoring and I can detect something or detect the non-compliance, 3 months from when the task occurred. I need to get earlier into the process workflow so that way I have the ability to monitor before it becomes a non-compliance and have a corrective action in place to prevent that non-compliance. So when you think about continuous monitoring, is having that ability to get upfront earlier in the process so you can inject the controls where you'll get the most value and most impact of those controls. Third is complete and frequent data acquisition. So this is really important, and we'll talk about it a little bit in further slides in terms of bringing in this data from all these source systems that we have within our environment. How often were we bringing in that data? You didn't want to just bring that data in, say, weekly or biweekly or monthly even, because our world, given the high transactional volume of our world, with all of the things that we have to comply with, we needed something that was going to be more frequent so we had a sense of today, were we compliant? And that's what this piece of continuous monitoring incorporates is every day, everywhere, we should know whether or not we're compliant. We can't afford to wait to day 2. Fourth, there is proactive auditing. So what's the sense of waiting for an auditor to come in and audit us every year, every 3 years, every 6 years to tell us whether or not we're mitigating risk? Part of continuous monitoring is making sure that you're proactively auditing yourself and doing it on a frequent basis based on your risk level. And then last, informed decision-making and risk management. It's probably my favorite bullet out of the entire list because we can bring in this data, we can bring visibility to our programs, but if you don't have an operational model to actually tell you what to do if you see something in off-normal condition, then you're really not maximizing the value of that continuous monitoring function. So with these 5 MVP, this is how we've defined continuous monitoring for us, and we hope to share that definition with you in industry at large. I talk about the operational model, and I'll talk a little bit about how when we bring in and we look at a particular domain within our space, one of the things we look at is what are the failure modes? What can go wrong with a particular domain? What can go wrong with patch management? What can go wrong with asset management? And there's a litany of things that if we all, again, polled this room, we can probably come up with a pretty decent list of all the failure modes that we can identify for these domains. So first and foremost, when we're bringing in and evaluating a domain, we look at those failure modes, typically performed through an FMEA for those Six Sigma folks in the room. Then we look at, okay, well, how can we mitigate those things? When we talk about internal controls, oftentimes during an audit, we'll get a list of internal control questions. And quite frankly, some of them feel like narrative type questions that are more appropriate maybe for an RSAW narrative versus actually talking about internal controls. And when we talk about internal controls, that was the next layer of continuous monitoring that we wanted to bring more clarity to. When you think about internal controls, you're either stopping something or you're detecting something. You're preventing it from happening or you're detecting it from happening. And you're either doing that through an automated mechanism or through a manual mechanism. So we simplified our view around what internal controls were so we can start to develop not only our failure mode inventory, so what are our risks, but then also what are those internal controls that help mitigate those risks and the frequency in which we're executing on those controls. That's the start of our risk register for a program and also our internal control library. Lastly is that operational model. So I now bring in this data, I've implemented these controls. What if I find something? What do I do? Aside from self-reporting if I need to, what do I do internally to address that risk? And that's what that operational model is intended to do, is really be very prescriptive down to each domain, each specific requirement, and identify what do you do if you see something. So introducing the NERC Information Command Center. I'm extremely proud and excited to share this with you. I'm looking forward to your questions, but we've actually built a physical room in our Jupiter West location down in Florida, dedicated to NERC compliance. Blessed with our leadership support, we were able to now open up this room back in March of 2024. And behind this room has an information management system that brings to life this concept of continuous monitoring and audit support, real-time continuous monitoring and audit support. It gives us down to a daily view with information directly from our source systems of what's going on within our environment down to the task level, all with relationships built back to our BES assets and cyber assets. So at any point, I know exactly what's going on from a CIP compliance perspective for each one of my BES assets and cyber assets within the purview of our program. It's well over 9,000 devices and well over 15,000 physical openings if we include low impact and climbing. To Bob's point, we're going to grow another 3x. What this NERC Information Command Center has been able to do for us is really de-risk the business. This is above and beyond compliance at this point. We're talking about augmenting even the mitigations of cybersecurity and physical security risk tied to both the CIP side and also the O&P side from a reliability perspective. So it's a view we never had before in terms of our posture, not only to be able to say we're compliant, but then also to say, are we meeting the intended purpose of what the NERC compliance obligations are calling out for in each one of the standards? So we're not stopping with CIP. We will be looking into, and we've already started to bring in some of the O&P requirements that I'll talk about in a second. These are examples of PRC5 and FAC8. We're currently working on bringing in the data associated with both of these standards, and this ties back to one of the earlier slides where Bob showed the most violated standards. We needed to do something different, to be quite honest. If we're going to be looking at highly violated standards, and they're the same violated standards over a 15, 20-year period, we owe it to ourselves as an industry to reimagine how we're doing things so we can change what that graph looks like the next time that report is published. So we took it as a personal challenge. We said, let's look at the highly most violated standards. When we went live with the NICC, we started with asset, patch, and change management on the CIP side. Probably three of the most, if not violated standards, probably the most foundational standards in terms of risk mitigation from a CIP compliance perspective. And then you see here for PRC5 and FAC8, real-time visibility into FAC8, ability to generate audit evidence for FAC8 at a click of a button. PRC5, when you talk about maintenance and missing time windows, we saw a lot of correlations between the tasks that we were doing in CIP and the tasks that we were doing in O&P. I'll offer you guys this as an example. We looked at CIP and we said we have BES assets and cyber assets. We started looking at FAC8 and we saw, man, this is awfully similar. When we think about FAC8, what do we have? Well, we have facilities and we have elements. We have BES assets, facilities, we have cyber assets and elements. There's relationships there that mean a lot in terms of if you were to coexist those in an asset management type of database, flag them accordingly, you can start to see where the unification of CIP and O&P kind of interlock. Now we're talking cybersecurity, physical security, and reliability of the grid. You couple that with the fact that we have operational models for each one of these views. When we bring, I'll show you in a second, a couple of views that we have within the NICC. But within the NICC, we have a rule. We don't bring anything into the NICC unless it's coming, from a source system that we can aggregate from. And if a source system does not exist, then we're working back with the line of business to re-engineer the process so they can get into an automated system. So we're not just leaving the manual processes in place. We're essentially being Excel spreadsheet killers. If they exist, we're eliminating them. Okay? 10,000 is what he said, okay? So my job was to remove all 10,000. So pray for me. So we're bringing in the visualization. So that's one rule. I need it to come from a source system, okay? Second is I need to be able to operationalize that view. There's no sense of me building a PRC5 or a FAC8 view inside of this room if I can't operationalize it So if I see something wrong, I can actually prevent a noncompliance. So my two rules going into the room is, let's get it into a source system. Let's automate the data. Let's make the data observable versus it being on a SharePoint site, baked folders deep. And also make sure that we can operationalize the views. Let's talk a little bit about the system. So this is an eye chart. Please don't try to zoom in because you probably won't have any luck, okay? I will gladly share some of this information after this session. But what I wanted to show here was, let's talk about the ERT workbook as an example, a use case, okay? In the ERT workbook, you have your BES asset, cyber asset, ESP, EAP, PSP, TCA, procurement, personnel tabs, a series of tabs with metadata that we have to give to the audit teams. And it's traditionally used as an audit tool. So everything you see highlighted with the red boxes are the ERT workbook tabs or examples of the ERT workbook tabs. If you were to go into my database right now, you would at minimum see every field that's in the ERT workbook, you would see it in the database, minimum. But everything in the blue, we said, again, opportunity to reimagine our work. And this is where we had a lot of fun. I challenged my team to say, if you were the author, if you owned the ERT workbook, what would you do different? What would you add? What would you change to make the program stronger, to give you the visibility that you say you've always wanted? And that unlocked a series of ideas that really breathed life into the NIC. I'll give you an example on the bottom there. In the cyber asset tab, you'll notice nowhere in the cyber asset tab does it ask for the recovery utility that's used to back up a cyber asset and the frequency of that backup. And yet, if you look at the level 1 data request for CIP 9, it's the one data request in the ERT workbook that's not sampled. They require 100% of the population. So how do you tie back all of your recovery plans to your cyber assets to ensure you have a recovery plan for all your cyber assets? And you know that all of those cyber assets, where applicable, are being backed up. You add it to your ERT workbook as a part of your metadata. So this is an area where we said, reimagine the work, reimagine the data that we are capturing, and start to add it. And all the other blue boxes that you see there, again, call out areas where we said we were going to add to that metadata set. Another good example is there's nowhere in the ERT workbook that calls out what are all of your software elements that are installed on your cyber assets. You need that in order to do patch assessments for CIP 7R2. The only place that it asks for that is in your baseline evidence, and it's a check the box on whether or not you have a baseline. It's not mitigating risk on whether or not you've missed or you have a software in your environment that you haven't done a patch assessment for. So we have a dedicated table for that. So that way it aggregates all software in our environment directly sourced from our baselines, and we can trigger patch assessments off of that real time. So let's talk about the system. I mentioned source systems. We were data rich. So these are examples of our source systems that we have within our environment. There's a laundry list of them that I did not include on here just for simplicity's sake, but none of these should shock anybody in the room. I bet if we poll the room, a lot of folks are using some, if not all of these systems. We looked at even systems or feeds that we can get externally, like a direct feed from NOAA, because we do live in the state of Florida, so hurricanes are a thing. So I'll talk a little bit about how we've brought in NOAA as a source system, but the focus of this slide here is to communicate how does this system work, bare minimum, and it starts with those source systems. Now, what this allowed us to do is allow the business units, I talked about the business units having source systems and data of their own, to essentially stay in their world. They can continue to operate in their systems as normal, so I don't have to force a business unit to move into a new system or spend millions of dollars to bring them into a new system. They can continue to use their existing systems, just like you could continue to use your existing systems within your organizations. Now, bringing in that data via an ETL, so we would build a feed, extract, transform, load. It's a common technology used. Again, I'm not shocking anyone, I'm sure, within the room. But from these source systems, it's our translator. It allowed the business units to call, say, something a host, and for us to translate host into cyber asset by way of these ETLs. So I would bring in data from these source systems. We would do a mapping to what it's called in the source system, translate it into the nomenclature and into the database fields that we needed, and that's how it ends up into our data warehouse. This is all on-prem technology using common Microsoft tools like SSRS and SSIS, my MS SQL database server. So these are not proprietary tools per se, but the approach itself has allowed us to unlock and essentially unify our program. We needed also a way, as we brought in this data, to audit ourselves. So shame on us for bringing in this data and not actually auditing whether or not this system works. So we built a view, a dedicated view that we've operationalized for all the ETLs that are within the system. And what I'm showcasing here in the demo here is the ability to cycle through different domains, so say asset management, patch management, risk management, and look at all of the all of the ETLs that are within our system and validate their health. Every day, we get a refresh of these ETLs and a validation on whether or not this data can be relied upon. So every day, my team will attest, the first view I look at when I walk into the room is this one. And I expect a 0 every day. If we don't have a 0, we turn to our operational model. Remember, I told you there's no view that goes into this room without an op model. So that op model will tell us if I see a 0 under failed jobs there, I'm going to triage that job and reset that ETL, bring in a fresh data set before end of day, so that way I can continue to rely on that data as I look at all the other views I have within the room. So this is essentially, think of it as an internal control for the NIC. And it's foundational to essentially how the system works. This view, I will admit, it looks rather complicated. That's why I allow my team to do all the technical stuff, and I look at the 5 or the 0 on top, success and failed. But it's intended to draw out the fact that it's comprehensive. So I don't want anybody to walk away saying, wow, that's extremely complicated. Yes, it is complicated. However, the way I look at this screen is it gives me comfort. It gives me comfort over the comprehensive nature of the functionality being provided by the NIC. Let's talk about our journey for asset management. Again, foundationally, asset management for us, we needed to start there. You know, everything in the SIP environment starts with SIP2. If you really don't attack SIP2 and have rigorous process around that, this is just almost calls for a cascading effect into the other domains. So when we looked at asset management, we needed a way to aggregate from all of the asset management inventories that we have throughout the different business units into one unified view for all of NextEra by registered entity. So we said, okay, we're going to receive these views or these data feeds from all the source systems that we have within our business units, and we're going to aggregate them into our data warehouse, a system that's actually supporting the NIC. One step would be to aggregate and then essentially be able to produce ERT workbook and build a view that visualizes this data. That's pretty easy. The part that we wanted to, again, reimagine so we can inject a layer of control within our SIP2 space is there are business rules inherent to asset management that are extremely important that we make sure that we monitor on a day-to-day basis. Like if an IP address has changed, or if a ESP ID is missing from a cyber asset that needs to have an ESP ID, or if I have a PSP ID on my cyber asset tab that's not identified on my PSP tab, these are indicators of something's wrong with your asset management metadata. Again, SIP2 asks you to recertify your data set of BES cyber systems, BES cyber assets. We didn't stop there. So every 15 months, we actually recertify for every one of our entities the entire ERT workbook because we have the ability to produce it at a click of a button. So that calls for recertifying by way of signature and review of our SIP senior manager, all of our BES assets, cyber assets, ESPs, EAPs, PSPs, TCAs, which is not even in scope for SIP2, and all of our other BCSI tab, things of that nature that are tied to our cyber assets. So that way we know if whether or not our asset management program is truly complete and accurate. This is a bit of a unique use case, but we are looking to expand it. With this data, so imagine you have all of this metadata in one view for asset management. You know where every one of your BES assets are. You know wherever your cyber assets are. What can you do with that? Well, I told you in Florida, we have a thing called hurricanes, and we have to get really good at hurricanes because quite frankly, we just live with that environment. So we have to be proactive in the methods that we put in place to help mitigate risk. We said, well, we have all this metadata. What if we got a feed from NOAA and overlaid that feed with NOAA with our BES asset and cyber asset listings? That's exactly what we did. And introducing storm response or storm mode here for NextEra, what we do now is we actually are included in the operational response for storms when they hit the state of Florida or anywhere in our service territory. We have the ability to now proactively look at the path of the storm, look at what sites are in place of that storm, what cyber assets are at those locations, and if there are any off-normal conditions identified currently that we need to take action on before the storm hits. So now CIP compliance, aside from just your CECs and the paperwork associated with a CEC, now becomes proactive in our approach when it comes to storm response. Think of TCAs. You have TCAs that may be deployed at your substations, let's say as an example. And one of those TCAs, or maybe even both, are offline. They're not connected to their AV system or their patching system. But do you still send that PNC engineer out prior to the storm to be able to use those TCAs, knowing that they're not connected? Well, prior to storm response, we didn't even know if they were connected. Now we know. So we can actually proactively try to fix these things before we send folks out to these CIP substations and triage before a storm. So we're now embedded as a part of that storm response using this view. Oh, my fave, security patch management. All right, so let me talk to you about our story for security patch management. And for those that are Six Sigma certified, just so you know why it's my fave, I did my green belt on on patch management. So we had to start from scratch when it came to patch. Our approach to patch was every patch assessment was essentially documented in an Excel spreadsheet. So take McAfee as a software. That item was labeled in the Excel spreadsheet. Every month, I would have a new spreadsheet just for McAfee. And it would talk about the patch assessment that I did, and that patch assessment evidence would get filed away in a specific BCSI storage location that only maybe one of two people knew exactly where it was at. So I was dependent on those people to be able to find them. And we would do that replicated across all of our software titles. Just to give you a ballpark of how many software titles we have today within our environment, if you aggregate them, it's about 500 software titles across every month that we have to do patch assessments for. We're talking large volumes if you start to multiply it across our environment. An impossible task if you're not throwing a bunch of SMEs at this and essentially crossing your fingers that they're doing patch assessments every month. And as you can see there, we weren't necessarily missing the bar holistically. It's not like we were not doing our patch assessments, but we were religiously missing the date, the 35-day due date or requirement by at least 1 to 7 days. And again, not acceptable within our environment as we look to reimagine our work. So we went on a journey to fix that. We said, okay, well, first and foremost, what do I need in order to do a patch assessment? Well, I need to know every one of my cyber assets. We talked about asset management and how we recertify that population of data. Then we need to know all of the software installed on those cyber assets. We can do that by a couple of different ways. In our environment, we do it either through automated or manual ways. So we do a software discovery using Tripwire. If we can install Tripwire, we do it. If not, we have manual baselines and we can bring in that data from our manual baselines. And we then have our universe for patch. All software installed in our environment are either identified through automated discovery or manual baselines. That was our genesis. We said, okay, if we know what that number is and we have confidence that that list and that population of software is complete and accurate, we can start to hum here in this process. So we started off with asset discovery, both from a cyber asset perspective and software asset perspective. And we went in and brought that all into a centralized database, into our NICC. From there, we're able to generate automatic patch assessments. So gone are the days where you're creating an Excel spreadsheet. If you're a subject matter expert in our environment, you're being assigned a form, a patch assessment form in a system that's observable, that gets stored in a database. And you have now 25 days to complete that patch assessment. We actually built in an internal threshold to complete that patch assessment within 25 days. All you're doing is filling out that form and then attaching your evidence to that form to substantiate compliance. What that 25-day window gave us was the ability to validate that information. Remember, I talked about continuous monitoring and constantly auditing yourself. It gave us the ability to have a 10-day window to now look at those patch assessments that were completed and validate whether or not they were complete and accurate and had all of the evidence needed to stand alone during an audit. Our metric for audits, just for everybody's context, our level 3s should show a downward trend. Our expectation is that we are having little to no level 3s and that we're able to substantiate compliance all in level 2 data requests. That's going to require evidence that is very different than what we produced before. That includes annotating evidence, that includes having evidence that can be generated out of a system, like in this example, and then ultimately monitored in our NICC. So as patch assessments are being completed, we actually monitor the burn down rate of all 500 software titles that need patch assessments every month. So the way we set up our team is in my team, we have a monitoring on-call, if you will, where we have a series of analysts that are responsible for monitoring the work in this space. So there's a view in the room that they're actually monitoring patch assessments as they're completed on a daily basis. And as they're completed, they're randomly sampling all of the patch assessments that are being completed and auditing them to validate the evidence. And I'm going to show you how we do that using AI in a second. The positive of this is that we can now, again, I mentioned getting earlier in the workflow so we can prevent a non-compliance. We're in that space now. We actually have caught scenarios where someone completed the patch assessment 100% perfectly, but maybe attached a stale screenshot to the evidence. Maybe they added last month's screenshot by accident and they meant to put this month's screenshot. So we've actually caught that and been able to fix that before the 35-day window is up. What are the results? And they're staggering. I don't blame you if you don't believe me, but I can actually show you the data, okay, I promise. But we are now at averaging a 24-day completion rate for all of our patch assessments across all of NextEra Energy for all registered entities. That is part and part because we have that 25-day window, because we have an operational model that causes us to escalate anything that's not done within the 25-day window, and the fact that we monitor it on a daily basis. We are now doing more validation today and producing better compliance evidence today with less involvement from as many SMEs as we had in the past. So we've now streamlined our patch management process that it's auto-generated from a population perspective, again, teeing up the software, auto-generating the patch assessments and assigning them to the appropriate people, and then monitoring the process end-to-end and validating that the information is complete and accurate. All powered by the NICC. All right. I'm going to ask the AV team to maybe press play on this demo for me. And I'll describe what's happening here. So just by a raise of hands, if I shout out SIP7R2L201, does everybody know what that data request is? It's my favorite data request. All right, it's the one for patch management, level 2, okay? So tell me if your experiences are different, maybe by a raise of hands if they're that different, okay? So that way I know just from benchmarking. But historically, if a region comes in, they give us this data request that's in scope. They're using RATstats, the sample. They usually give us anywhere between 29 to 33 maybe sample devices, and they might sample maybe 3 months during the audit period. What this report is actually doing, because all of this data is in a system and it's observable, it allows me to give input into the NICC, the 33 devices that the auditors gave us as a part of the sample set, the 3 months that they gave us as a part of the sample set, and generate the audit data request response in seconds. All knowing that this information is completely validated prior to even running the report. What it also does is it actually gives you standalone evidence. If you notice some of the columns in there, it provides the counters that we know that the auditors are actually looking for. Like for every patch assessment, did you meet the 35-day window? We added in the counter for that. So we actually tell the auditors in our cover sheet whether or not, or how many days it took to complete each individual patch assessment that's produced by this report. This used to take us 6 weeks with over about 20 people to complete. So an auditor would give us this data request, and oftentimes we would have to ask them for an extension before we even started our work because we knew it would take us that long. Okay, we just did this for the CERC audit that we're currently underway, and it took us actually 5 days to complete it end to end. That included generating the report and just doing double checks of the data to make sure. This is our first real pressure test of the actual report. And where we tried to pull it manually, we would have never made the deadline for this. To date, we've only gotten one interview request for CIP 7 R2 because our data just stands alone. We used to get 10 to 15 easily in terms of interviews or level 3 data request responses. We've got one. So a market difference, and as you can see there in terms of timing and improvement, this is an 80% improvement, but what I really want to call out is this saves our company dollars. This is O&M that we just never have to realize because we now have this data in a system. So where I talked about an audit potentially costing about $1 million just to execute and support, that number has now gone down because of this. I don't need 20 subject matter experts to produce this evidence by business unit anymore. I can generate it independently, knowing that it's been validated. So the future is bright. We didn't stop here. We said, all right, we're data rich. We got a bunch of these really nice views that give us visibility into our program that we've always dreamed of. But there's this little thing out there called AI. And so it was too enticing not to go out and really see what's the art of possible here. What could we do with this data? We have a very structured environment, structured data set. Said, all right, well, let's start thinking about it. Let's start prototyping some things and seeing what could we continue to improve with this technology, using AI and enabling it as more of an addition to our toolbox than anything else. Where do we start? We said, well, there's a lot of good information out there. Let's start building a library. There's a lot of good information that the regions publish on their websites, guidance and just materials on how to comply and areas to look out for in a particular SIP domain. There's NERC published documentation, other industry partners like EEI and NETF. We have our own internal documentation that really talks about how we do what we do. And then we have our source systems. We have all of those things feeding this library, and now you can start to see where AI can be unlocked. Use cases like an advanced virtual auditor, introducing AVA, NICC powered by AVA, gives us the ability to now audit ourselves, again, real time against the data sets, using published information, both publicly and information that we have internally regarding our processes, to now help improve how we're validating our information and the speed in which we're validating it. Again, trying to drive down that O&M costs associated with our compliance obligations and really driving home an improvement, a marked improvement in how we're able to comply and show how we substantiate compliance across our enterprise. So this is a demo of AVA. I'm going to have the AV person just kind of turn up the volume here, walk you through
Test.
it.
AVA, test.
Test, test. Loud and clear.
AVA, what time is it?
Current time is 13:57.
AVA, please generate the ERT workbook.
Generating workbook now.
AVA, thank you.
You're welcome. What else can I do for you today?
AVA, please validate the ERT workbook.
Validating ERT workbook.
So this is where the business rules come into place. So just keep that in mind. Okay.
Validation report summary. Total off normal conditions across all validations, 3,041. Report with the most off normal conditions, 2,242. Null counts cyber asset tab.
AVA, please tell us about the patch management process.
So we're jumping into patch
The
now.
patch management process involves tracking, evaluating, and installing cybersecurity patches for applicable cyber assets. This includes identifying sources the responsible entity monitors for patch releases for updatable cyber assets with available patches.
AVA, please review evidence for this week, SIP 7R2.
Reviewing evidence for patch assessments. Please note, this will take a minute, but someone here will explain the process.
Okay, thank you, Ava. So what Ava's doing right now is scanning the evidence and verifying timestamp and software version with what's found in the associated SR ticket. If any off-normal conditions are found, for example, the timestamp does not match or it is not found, she'll flag that item. Same with the software. If it's not found or it does not match within the SR ticket, those items will be flagged.
Evidence validation complete. Total off-normal conditions that need to be investigated, 3.
And here we go. We got the total count of off-normal conditions at the associated SR. And over here, we have some of the off-normal conditions that were found. For example, no date found, no firmware. Very similar to how with TurboTax, you can upload your tax document and it does most of the work for you. And at the end, it tells you what needs to be reviewed. Thank you.
All right, so I'll summarize, okay, because I know some of the voice is a little tough to hear. So first thing you just saw was Ava generating the ERT workbook, okay? For any one of our registered entities, we have the ability to segment that out, and we can produce that ERT workbook. That's just, that's just basic audit support type function. But then Ava then has a series of business rules that we've taught her that's associated with validating the data within the ERT workbook. And she came back with off-normal conditions, so things that she saw in the data set that was not connecting based off of our business rules. And she told us what those were and highlighted the one that had the most count or the most, it's bucketed. So how many items within that particular bucket, and she gave us a summary of which one was the highest one, but had a summary on the Excel spreadsheet that called out the count for each business rule where it was violated, so we could actually go right to it and find it and rectify it. So again, Ava then is now giving us the ability, think about the confidence level we have for our asset management program now, where we are being told by this AI agent using our business rules that we've taught her on how to validate that information and make sure that it's current every time we go to recertify our SIP2 list. The last thing you saw, which is extremely powerful, is the combination of Ava using business rules that we called out and taught her with the use of OCR technology. So how many times have you created a patch assessment? You go to the patch source, you take a screenshot showing that you went to the patch source with the date and timestamp and attach it to your patch as evidence to close it out. But I remember I gave you an example of where we've already caught cases where people maybe mistakenly put in the wrong screenshot. So Ava was using OCR technology to scan the screenshot that's part of that patch assessment and validate the date against the patch assessment ticket. So if the patch assessment ticket said March 15th and the date of the screenshot did not say March 15th, it flagged it for us and gave us that in a summary form for any off-normal conditions. So you see the power of continuous monitoring now coming to real life using AI technology, things that traditionally would take a human weeks to be able to do, and you're lucky if you get enough coverage to give you the level of reasonable assurance that you're looking to get. We can now do this for 100% of the population in seconds with the power of AI. And if you thought I was stopping there, we have not. We are now expanding the room. Pleased to announce that we're now bringing in NICC 2.0, where we're going to be doubling the size of the room this year. By the end of this year, we will have all of our entities, registered entities within the room from a SIP compliance perspective. And then we are also expanding into 10 O&P requirements. So we'll have a complete unified NERC Information Command Center by the end of 2025 with the plans and roadmap to have all of O&P within the space within the next 3 years. So when we're fully realized by 2029-ish, we'll have a place where we have a fully functional NERC Information Command Center where we have visibility and correlation between the SIP side of the house, again, security and reliability using the O&P standards. And with that, I'll pass it off to Bob to talk a little bit about more of the modules.
All right, now that Carlos handled all the tough slides, I'll finish this out. But I wanted to leave this up because this really summarizes what we built from a continuous monitoring standpoint, all the elements that go into continuous monitoring. You know, I think one thing I would caution people is, you know, this isn't available anywhere. You can't go buy this from a current software provider or a GRC tool. None of them do it. When we started out on this mission, we wanted to buy this. I mean, we went out and we talked to everybody, and some of the quotes we got were astronomical, like from ServiceNow. It was in the you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, and we're a big company, but we can't afford that. So we decided to build it in-house. Everything you saw was built not only in-house, but within our group. We didn't even use IT as a design group. Now, what was key for us to be able to pull this off was that we engaged a strategic partner in Guidehouse. The Guidehouse has been with us from the first step, and they provided, you know, resources and, you know, expertise that we did not have on our staff, but they were key in terms of getting us to where we are today. And, you know, I'm proud to say that, you know, we have these modules now. We've created modules that are portable, that can be used by anybody. I think if you look at the module offerings 1 through 5, you know, asset management and audit prep package modules can be used by any of you. All they need to do is be connected to your source systems. So if you're interested, you know, we're going to be available. I think we've set up a demo room that's in the colonnade just around the corner. So if you want to stop in sometime today to see a one-on-one demo, we're certainly available to do that. We are connected live with our development environment. It doesn't contain any real data, but it has the full capability of AVA and of all the modules. So if you want to see a particular screen, if you want to see the PRC5 screen, the FAC8 screen, you know, please stop by and we can drill down and show you the functionality that's in there. But with that, I think we'll invite Bill Fletcher to join the panel to give us any regulator insight into what he's seen today. But now we're open for questions.
So that was awesome. Can you hear me? Okay. Maggie Sala, PG&E. I love how you were able to use your source data and pull that into something that you can manipulate yourselves to know what's going on before something happens or shortly after something shouldn't have happened. I've been around long enough to know that often our data isn't as good as we think it is. And you all don't control the source data that's owned by other people throughout NextEra. How do you ensure that that data is pristine before you pull it in and that it maintains being pristine as you aren't the ones inserting that data into the source record?
Yeah. Okay, thank you. First of all, Maggie, great to see you again. It's been a little bit of time since we've seen each other. Thank you for the question. You know, when we went through and first implemented, there was a lot of cleanup that we needed to do, especially from an IP address standpoint. But that was a good thing to do. You know, not having the correct IP addresses, whether they're primary or backup in your system, is not a good thing. So there was initial cleanup. Now it's maintaining. And the beauty of the system is AVA will identify any mismatch. So any of these abnormalities or off-normal conditions, they're probably bad data. It's probably fat finger data. But immediately, you know, we respond to the subject matter expert and say, hey, you got a wrong entry here. So it's corrected almost immediately.
What I'll also call out that I think is important is, you know, I keep referencing the operational model. Part of that operational model that we have for asset management in particular is when we see information wrong with the data, we go back to the source system and have them adjusted and fixed, okay? So that's after the fact. To your point, we want to get in front of that. So the other part of this is, you know, we talked a little bit about the ETL process. and bringing in the data from the source systems. Part of establishing those ETLs is doing a source to target mapping and making sure that the required fields in the source systems are there. So the fact that we have this NERC Center of Excellence at NextEra, a centralized group, we have the ability to inject that into our op model and our processes to say, if you have a source system, minimum requirements for that source system are the following. And that includes the metadata that we require, but then also rigorous process to maintain that data. A good example would be onboarding a new cyber asset as an example. When you're building a new cyber asset, there's metadata associated with our asset management program that we need to ingest, that we then say it is now required as a part of your onboarding process to enter that information and also have a validation mechanism in the source system. So that way we're truing up not only the receipt of that data, so we know it's clean, but we know that there's an earlier control in the process to make sure that the data is what we need and what we expect.
Okay, wow. I mean, I think, this is just like beyond. I'm so impressed. I'm sure I could speak for everyone here that you guys have floored us. I mean, it's amazing. It's like the dream that we want to get to. I have like a few questions. My first question, we keep talking about source systems. I'm audit background, so my thinking of the source system is the asset, is the cyber asset. So, and your source systems in the presentation showed as the collection systems or the systems to actually, do something with those assets. So do you guys go, or at some point, did you get comfort over those collection systems doing what they need to do? Or do you ever go and validate against the cyber assets? That's my first question.
Great question. So yes, we do. So a good example I'll call out is maybe Tripwire. Typically, Tripwire, when you look at it, is a baseline config tool. It's a baseline monitoring tool. But on our SIP, it's on our SIP2 list, right? So it's not just a non-SIP device. It's on our SIP2 list, right? So when we think about Tripwire, it's interrogating the actual BES cyber assets. And so when it does that, there are validation controls in place against that interrogation. So again, getting the controls earlier into the source systems. When I say source systems in terms of the NIC, it's essentially, it could include devices that are on our SIP2 list. It just depends really on their function. So it could be a combination of those devices on our SIP2 list, plus tools like an ITSM tool, like a change gear or task management tool of some sort. It can be a mixture of both.
Thanks for that. And then how long did it take you guys to implement this in-house? And also, is this on-prem or is this on the cloud?
Yeah.
Can it be on-prem?
No, this is all on-prem. And from concept and idea to today, it's been a 5-year journey. And get back to your first question in terms of interrogating the devices. We don't only rely on Tripwire, we have Tenable, and then for substations, we have Blueframe that we're introducing. And that not only gives us the capability of pulling the compliance information from those devices themselves, but it allows the opportunity to do remote work on those devices.
Correct.
The other thing, and I'm going to get to your second question, but the excitement about CIP and O&P being in the same room is going to reduce cost. And think about truck rolls. For us to roll a truck to plug in a TCA to a substation, what a waste of money. But if we know that there's an O&P task being done at that substation tomorrow, we'll combine tasks. Hey, while you're out there, while you're testing the relay or whatever you're doing, plug in the TCA for us. And that saves quite a bit of time. The journey was not in a straight line. We went down not a lot, but some dead ends. First we tried to get everybody using the same tool. That was impossible because generation doesn't want to use the same tool as transmission because their worlds are different, right? And they're on different cycles of upgrades and whatever. So after the first year, we abandoned get everybody on the same tool. What we went to was this aggregator model. And that was one of those aha moments where, hey, businesses, you do whatever you're doing. We'll aggregate the data. We'll tell you the data we need. You tell us what you call it, and you point us to where that data is, and we can get to it. I cannot say enough about senior leadership support for them to trust us with capital dollars and to understand our vision and allow us to do it. It's just been a blessing. You know, Carlos and I, every day we say, you know, we're very grateful to work for NextEra that allows us to build something this on just, you know, they just had faith in us.
Thank you.
I'll just touch on if for those that are in the room that are a little technical, the cloud question. So if you're thinking about, well, how did you make this all work with the Microsoft products? When you talk about the three buckets of technology that really is the underpinning for the system, it's SSIS, which is really used for the ETL process. So bringing the data in from source system A into the NIC. Okay, so think of it as an extension cord. Then you have the MSSQL database, which is really bringing the data, and that's the home base, if you will, right? That's the heart of the NIC. That is the database. But then you have Power BI, which a lot of our views are created in, which you have an instance of Power BI in the cloud, but then you have something called SSRS. So it's the on-prem instance of Power BI, essentially. So it's Power BI reporting server. And it gives us all the same functionality that you would get in the cloud. There's some things in the cloud when it talks about like geographic maps and things of that nature that you might get enhanced functionality with. But for the most part, it's a one-to-one in terms of its capability. So that's how we were able to keep everything on-prem. And then all of these environments are all classified as BCSI storage locations, because that's the next piece that I'm going to start to attack is the reduction of BCSI storage locations in our environment because we just have too many. And we, quite frankly, we don't need them with this system. Yes, sir.
Mike Kroom from WECC, cybersecurity auditor for SIP 5, SIP 7, SIP 12, SIP 11, a little bit of everything. I have 3 questions that were coming to mind on the presentation. And by the way, great presentation. I was getting goosebumps. Some goosebumps were good, other ones were not so good. But I think I have 3 questions. 1, how do you define a vendor, if you have that such definition applied yet? 2, where does Ava live, and could she almost be concluded as a vendor now, even though she's AI? And number 3, and you're kind of already mentioned this, is about BCSI. So with data in transit, so those type of scenarios, especially because I know how ServiceNow works with data in transit and all that, and how they have their repositories. How are you guys approaching those type of levels of compliance?
Okay, I'll take the first question because my memory isn't that great and I won't remember what the other 2 were. So I'll let Carlos handle that.
Got it.
But picking a vendor, that was really one of the most important things we did at the beginning of the journey. We've had a long-standing relationship with Guidehouse, and you know, when we first engaged Guidehouse to help us on this journey, the first thing was, you know, help us pick a software vendor that can do this for us. You know, it was kind of, you know, give us a vendor analysis, and they went out and we went out and we couldn't find anybody that was even close. And every time we would meet with a software company, and I could say the names and you would recognize them all, we knew more about this space than they did. And we said, well, this is crazy. We're not going to pay for them to learn something. You know, we know it, we'll do it. And we asked Guidehouse, do you have the in-house expertise to fill the holes of skill sets that we need to pull this off? Like part of it was the database architecture. Carlos showed a snippet of the database structure framework. That is non-trivial. The relationships, the dependencies that are involved in making this work are non-trivial. We spent probably a good 1.5 years, 2 years for the first issue of that framework that worked. And now it's the hub. Every time we come up with something new, it gets connected to that framework, that architecture framework. That's really the secret sauce. And think about what that allows you to do. If you point to an asset in our environment, we can trace that to the access fields, and we can tell you exactly who has access to that box. We could point to the software fields and tell you exactly what software is on that box. And think about before we had that, you know, how hard of that is to do. And you think, well, that's pretty trivial. Can't you tell who has access to a box? Well, you know, with roles and responsibilities and entitlements, it's quite a task to do that. C, I don't remember the other two questions, so here's Carlos.
That's not fun. I'll jump in. All right, so Ava as a vendor, when you talk about Ava and its processing capability, nothing is being extracted from Ava using the cloud. I'll start off by saying that, okay? It is a mixture of an AI model combined with the use of Python scripting that give us the ability to do this. So a common use case, and it's actually a good one that we showed in the demo of validating the ERT workbook. We extract the data and then apply the AI model to perform the validation of it to tell us what we don't know. So that's the point we're at right now. We're starting to now look at, okay, how do we completely operationalize Ava and get her included as a part of the tech stack that the system uses? I think that's when we'll start to see and have to really triage, like, okay, how are we going to treat Ava? What's Ava's capabilities? How are we going to make sure that Ava is executed in a safe manner, quite frankly? So I think that we're still on that journey, but that's how we use her today. A lot of it is very much POCs, I would call them, but we're starting to prove out some of the things that we wish we had with AI. We're just answering the questions. Can it be done? And the answer so far is yes. Every time we try to build out a new AI model for a particular capability, it's hitting the mark. Another good example with the use of AI, just to kind of piggyback a little bit, is the auto creation of patch mitigation plans based on the vulnerabilities identified in your patch assessment. That takes humans to do today, often with varying levels of understanding of a patch, of the vulnerability, its capability in our environment, with bringing in feeds, not only from the source, the patch sources, but then also from sources like just the vulnerability databases that are out there from the different vendors. We're able to now, we're working on it to be able to produce automatic MIP plans based off of what's injected in the patch assessment, and then tee it up for the human to then be the final validator. Okay? And then the last question around BCSI, the data coming into our environment, so we're not sending anything out, but anything coming into our environment from a BCSI storage location is all encrypted from the source system. So that's how we're dealing with it in the in-transit piece of the requirement.
Okay. Just one quick question to follow up on that. Your centralized center that you have, do you have a backup?
Yes, yes. So we have a dev environment, we have a QA environment, and then we have a live production environment, and then the development environment. The beauty of it is the physical room. You can kind of see it in the picture there. We did two things, okay? Just to again, think about this from a risk perspective. We don't have a physical BCSI storage location at NextEra. Doesn't exist. But we treat this room like it's a high-impact PSP. It's protected as such. So all of the CIP6R2 requirements that we have, all of the CIP6R1 requirements that we have for logging and monitoring, the two-factor authentication on the room, 6-wall perimeter, this room has it, okay? Secondly, with our environment itself, the data is not in the room. I can actually unplug that room, turn it dark right now. We've lost no data. It's actually in the same data center that our EMS is in. So it's afforded that same physical electronic protections as our most critical systems, both in the primary and in the backup.
Thank you.
Yep. This is also, sorry, one more thing on the tech stack. It is also 100% a virtual environment, in case everybody was wondering.
Hi, Chris Chavez from Arriban. In light of, keeping the database pristine, as it was put, how do you inject yourself or participate in the change management process of all of your customers?
Well, okay, so yeah, I'm thinking of your type of change that you're thinking of as maybe a change to a workflow or a change to a data set. That's the beauty of our team.
Or changes to their environment.
Yeah, so that's the beauty of our team, is that anything from a process or tool change perspective, we're involved from the get-go. So if you're in building out a new tool, let's say you're replacing an existing tool and you're going with a different one, we're a part of that discussion when they're gathering the business requirements for that tool. So that never used to exist. So we would go out and say, I'll give you an example. We would replace our AV system. We'd go from Sophos to Trend Micro. And traditionally, that team would go and buy that new piece of system and install it in our SIP environment, and we'd get it from the time it went live going forward. Now we're being brought into the discussion prior to procurement. So that way we're having specific requirements injected, not only for the NIC continuous monitoring capabilities, but then also for anything related to an audit support. So say ERT workbook version 10 comes out tomorrow and there's a new data request, we catalog that and then now inject it as a part of our business requirements for anything new. Anything existing, it's essentially following the same process. And we would be a part of those requirements or the actual change to make sure that it doesn't impact our ability to monitor and or produce audit evidence. Yep. Again, it's a common theme of injecting our team earlier in the workflow for not only just your regular everyday compliance tasks, but then also for the things that, quite frankly, the SIP standards don't call out in terms of their purview, which is new system deployment or changes to existing systems.
Yep, I'd like to ask Bill a question if I could. Since we had the pleasure of hosting you in the NIC last year.
As long as it's not whether AVA qualifies as an unaffiliated third party.
Well, we'll hold that question in abeyance.
Thank you.
So Bill, any impression about what you saw about our approach? You saw the functionality firsthand. You sat in the middle of the room and saw the screens and talked to the operators. Any impression you want to share?
Yeah, lots. I mean, being invited to the think tank in Jupiter was really nice because it's an opportunity that risk that you took, have people with the regulator hats off, which is something we're trying to do. But, what I tried to do when it was invited is, try to check the assumptions at the door. So I could think of, okay, is this going to be in a control center or what it is that you're trying to do? And the idea there is just to, spent 80% of the time listening. Then we had the discussion. And, the things that came to mind were, number one, what we're doing foundationally with using ISO 31000 and a risk management approach. And clearly you're doing that. Failure mode effects analysis, that's something I've been interested in with some of my avocations. And if people are participate in Matthew Lewis's System Protection Working Group and Human Performance, failure mode mechanisms, we're going to be hearing a lot more of that. FMEA is just one flavor of that. So the impression is, and really, I think we kind of tripped into the FAC 8 discussion because I've worked with a lot of people on FAC 8. And if you don't know what your assets are, it's really hard to build up and get into system operating limits, relay loadability, and so forth. So here, this audience has bared with me a couple of times over the years with a slide that says it's 11:59 p.m. Do you know where your cyber assets are? And the reason that slide was produced was because sometimes we would go to different places for cyber asset validation and there would be mystery assets. You either couldn't find them or they weren't where they were supposed to be. So, the foundational asset management and taking a risk management and then saying that your DPMOs, your defects per million operations that translate to PNCs, it's a game changer for your assumption. And then I think what we talked about in the room is that if you focus on reliability at that level, beyond 5 nines or 6 nines, if you focus on reliability, then compliance comes along for the ride. So those are my impressions.
Great. If I think about FAC 8 and we think about the failure modes, why are there ratings that aren't consistent with their methodology? Having that room tied into operations helps us, because one of the risks that we have is like Carlos said, we have hurricanes, and during restoration, we're trying to get customers back up, and one of the things that we found is that if we track trucks and parts and visits to substations, including cameras that view people coming in, that after a storm clears and we have time, we can go back and check all those substations, make sure, jumpers are the big thing, right? Everybody changes jumpers out, then all of a sudden you got a ratings problem. But, we've incorporated those failure modes into the room so we can be proactive and respond to off-normal conditions.
Yeah, exactly. And the other perspective we talked about too is that, well, what do future audits look like? We can do those on sidebars, but there's probably opportunity for standards evolution, right? PRC5 was one of the few standards you can adopt a performance-based approach to maintenance, but there's also time interval changes, deltas, depending upon what's continuously monitored. And then, in 2011, there was some vendors that started offering a whitelisting within a protective relay. Well, how does that qualify for SIP 7R2? And some of your reliability brethren that were in Florida were in a presentation that we did at NERC about that. And there was a lot of dispute. Well, that doesn't qualify as whitelisting. Well, what is it then? So there's a lot of there's a lot of, I think, opportunity for evolution. And we have a question.
Hi, I'm Tracy Sheets. I'm with Tri-State, a co-op out of Denver, Colorado. And I have some questions about how many people are in your compliance program? Does it include the head count for like IT? Or are you guys doing this all through consulting? What's your annual budget?
Okay, so compliance people. So if you talk about all across NextEra, we have about 18,000 employees or so. We have a little bit over 100 people scattered throughout that are doing compliance work. In our group, we have 16 people in the Center of Excellence. Now, you know, in terms of budget for compliance or budget overall, or?
For this little project.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. So what I would ask you is that we talk one-on-one, and I'll answer, you know, that question. I don't want to answer a dollar figure in public for a number of reasons. The biggest one is that we're in a rate case year.
Okay. So back to so your Center of Excellence, does that include like just employees or consultants? And like, do you have IT people embedded in?
Yeah.
Because I mean, this is.
I'm really happy you
Bill.
asked that question because this piece is probably, if you guys ask me right now, what I'm the most proud of in terms of this room. While the room is awesome and cool and the system behind it is extremely powerful, like it really is a blessing to be able to have a system like this. It's our approach that we took with people. So I'll tell you guys two things that we did that I think is a bit unique in industry. So within our team specifically, we had to reimagine what the role of a traditional compliance analyst was. And we quickly realized that we needed to take a step back and look at the competencies, not only that we needed today to fulfill the obligations of our program, but then also the need to really reimagine what we need in the future. And that called for offering opportunities to non-traditional talent, even if they didn't work in the NERC space, like ETL developers, database modelers, things of that nature, server administrators. So we have dedicated people on our team that have joined our team as compliance analysts, but have these competencies and skill sets. You've now brought them into the NERC world that, quite frankly, they wouldn't have ever looked for our jobs because they were looking for a different type of role. They're now able to fulfill that. We couple that with, we've actively made investments in training our folks. So if you guys are familiar with ICS, I'm sorry, I think it's 456, the GCIP course that SANS offers. We actually take our folks through that course. So now you couple an ETL developer or a database modeler with the knowledge, foundational knowledge of SIP, and that is what unlocks this world.
Okay, one more question. Who is being interviewed in your audits?
It's a great question. We've actually been able to change that. So traditionally, we would have to, show up with 25 people, 30 people from different business units. Right now, today, it's all folks on our team. So we don't really need to phone a friend unless it gets really into the weeds. You're talking level 3, level 4 type technical discussions, and we'll do that if we need to. But that's been a market difference. And it was a very concerted effort in our approach to the people side of this, where we said, if we were going to build this, we wanted to, these people have been brute forcing audits year after year and essentially doing their day job plus all of these compliance tasks. We really wanted to give them that time back to be innovative in their space and allow us to kind of take the heavy lift on this knowing that we have these efficiencies at our fingertips.
Yeah, I know we're at time,
Thank you.
but it's amazing that we have a SIP audit going on now, and I get phone calls from the SMEs saying, are we having an audit now right now? You haven't called us. Yeah, we're good. We're good. Keep going. Just a reminder, we're going to be in the colonnade room. We're going to be set up to do demos. We'll look at actual screens. We can do a deep dive. So if you're interested, we'll be there the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos and Robert, very much for